So in my last video, I mentioned that there were two topics and I talked about one. And so I wanted to talk about the second. And I'm calling it Evolving Beyond Gendered Conditioning as a way to remind myself of where this came from. So the story that I want to share comes from an experience I had spending a weekend with my partner's brother who came to visit California. And basically, we did a typical Saturday in our lives, which involved going to the farmer's market, biking the coast, and just enjoying the environment that we live in. And then we had conversation. So I'm going to share what I learned from that experience, but also see it through the lens of a podcast that I heard yesterday, the day after he left, by Martha Beck, who is my life coach trainer, mentor. Big fan of all of her writing. And her new podcast called Bewilderment. Bewilderment. And what they were discussing in the podcast, I'll start with the podcast. What she was discussing with her partner, Rowan Mangan, were some reader questions, listener questions about, how to find our true nature when it comes to our very binary, very polarized gendered conditioning in this culture. We are going through a time in our society where all of our gender norms and labels and classifications and assumptions and categories are being blown apart especially by the youngest people in our society. And then, of course, there's the backlash of people who want to make sure that that doesn't happen and that the norms are kept as they are and have been for many generations. And so one of the quotes that Martha shared that was very powerful was, and it's powerful because it really boils things down, boils a lot of conclusions down to this, that boys are conditioned for war. Boys and men are conditioned for war, groomed for war. Girls and women are groomed for compliance. This is in the traditional system of norms, generally, broadly speaking. And so all of the progressive movements against that, so far, the progressive movements on the feminist side have been to try to give more girls and women the tools of war, right? That kind of equality on the male playing field, basically. And that was kind of step one. And now we have this attempt to kind of get rid of these polar opposites and allow both men and women, boys and girls, to find this fluidity of all that's in between there and the mixing of all these qualities to make a more complete person from both of these artificial extremes that we've defined. And she talked about how, for people to break down these rigid structures that have been established in so many systems, the war and the compliance with war, it's going to take people from each side of the polar opposites to break out of their boxes and come toward the middle, or it's not even the middle, it's the truth of all possibilities, the expansiveness of the field. And so to break out of the confines, the prisons of these narrow categories. And she said that the people that will break out first are the ones that have been experienced the most pain from being locked in. And so on the masculine side, we've been conditioned for a long time by war movies that glorified the battlefield and showed the um, the soldier walking off the steaming battlefield with dead bodies strewn everywhere and sort of congratulating himself on this heroic victory, and then not really following up with any of the natural questions like, you know, who's going to cook breakfast in the morning? That was women's responsibility. You know, who's going to repair the village that was just destroyed? That was also not mentioned. It's some other less heroic man's responsibility, maybe. Um, and then the first step of the rebellion against that narrative was people making movies like Deer Hunter, she mentioned, or Hurt Locker, which showed a different aftermath of men having gone to war and saying, "Hey, it wasn't that glorious or fun. It actually wrecked me." And to show the psychological and other effects of being a warrior, not just coming out as the triumphant hero, but the real cost. And and similarly on the female conditioning side, women need to break out of the roles of compliance and find their voice. And what does that look like? It doesn't necessarily mean for most of us becoming the opposite, like playing the toxic masculine game, becoming the warrior, although that was the only option that was available for so many, and still is. Most of the options available are moving on to the male battlefield and playing at that game, whether it's a corporate battlefield or the military one, or all the and all the playing fields that are metaphorically shaped by those values. And so when we are looking at the evolution of consciousness and trying to find bigger possibilities for all people, um, I was particularly moved or interested in her comment about how it will take a man, a cisgender male, who is a product of this binary system, to break out and show another way and to become a peacemaker or a proponent for peace. And this is where it ties back to my experience this weekend with our visitor. My partner's brother happens to be currently a public school teacher in a southwestern state, a public school elementary school teacher in southwestern United States. And he's been a teacher for 24 years. And in a previous life, he and my partner are the sons of a former prison warden in the California correctional system. So, in terms of exposure to the values of patriarchal, toxic masculinity and gender norms, they had a very, very extreme, definitive education in that. And that's something that they both talk about openly, and realizing the effects of that. But when he talked about what he values in his classroom and his, living in a COVID world and in this polarized world post 2016, and wanting to set a tone for young people and wanting to do something with the 9 months that he has with each group of people. He talked about teaching kindness and inclusion, and he talked about the diversity of cultures in his classroom and the languages spoken at home, and how he has learned from these kids and has asked them to learn from each other by creating an atmosphere of peace, joining hands every day and saying, we're going to be kind to each other in here, no matter what's happening at home, no matter what our parents are saying, no matter what other kids are doing. In this classroom, we do this way. And so he's setting, I was just so impressed by these values that he was setting. And as a man, as a white cisgender male coming from a background of toxic masculinity, and he explained that a lot of his commitments in his classroom today come from having worked as a prison guard in a very toxic environment, racist, sexist, toxic environment that he knew wasn't good for himself and was not good for the inmates. And he had to get out for himself and for him to move all the way to the other end of the spectrum as a peacemaker, not just escaping a toxic environment, but now consciously, actively creating hope and a vision of it, even an island of another possibility for those 27 children for those 9 months. And it was just so inspiring for me as an example of the level of focus and just realistic awareness of the impact that we can have with something small and well defined. I mean, to say, to just keep repeating that it's 27 kids for 9 months. Time is short, the numbers are small, but we're going to do this. We stand for this. This is what we do here. When we're in this classroom, this is how we behave. And with the amount of despair that we are forced to react to in the news, um, and then, with waves of our social media and the apparent downfall of so many things, it does take a lot of personal discipline to hold that vision and to keep a clear keep the channel clear. And he talked about how he takes care of himself with nature and animals and physical activity, exercise, and being inspired by the kids and listening to them, really finding out what they're about, getting to know them and connecting, and also not watching the news, um, staying mentally clear, really, so that he can be available to set this tone for the culture in his classroom. And to me, he's not somebody who would ever seek recognition for this. He would not want his story to be told publicly. He shares it openly, but he's not looking for like a profile in the local newspaper about all the things he's doing. It's just, this is what he's doing. And you could say it's a job, and it is his job, but it's definitely not just something he does for a paycheck, a small paycheck. It has, I don't think he uses the word, but it's a purpose, it's a focus, and it's a healing place for himself by giving and creating a healing environment for these kids and watching them thrive for the 9 months that he has them. And then understanding the limitations of his influence that, yes, he's one teacher for 9 months. And also knowing that he can have a big impact on someone's life and they can remember him for the rest of their lives as someone who was in their life and cared enough to do something inspiring and different from the world and create a little world for these kids, fifth graders. Um, so this is happening in the world. It made a big impact on me because, of course, I have been a teacher in the past of children. I, every once in a while, there'll be a little flicker of something that um, makes me wonder if that will ever back to me in my life. But what inspires me is that I stayed open. I was in my happy place, sharing my happy place. So I was very open, and he was very open to experiencing this with us. And then the conversations flowed very naturally. And to hear that, um, to hear this, it really blew apart a lot of my assumptions and preconceived notions about what's possible for a public school teacher, 24 years in, for a male who grew up with very deep patriarchal, toxic masculinity, both in the home and in the workplace, and to have a turnaround. And I'll say that one of the ingredients that he said was really important for him was um, being welcomed, included, and loved by his wife and her family, and the way that they welcomed him and allowed him to grow. So I remember just looking at, witnessing his life story and how he's evolved. It reminds me that, as people, there's sort of like two main ingredients we need from the people who love us. One is when we're born, we need that environment of total unconditional love and acceptance. Most of us don't get it because it's impossible to do perfectly. But that's the goal, to feel unconditionally loved and accepted in all of our humanity. And then as teenagers, as we're becoming adults, becoming like individuals and setting out on our adult way, we need to know that we can separate our own minds and our views and our feelings and reactions to things and have a difference between the people who loved us to begin with, people who brought us into this world and nurtured us. We can separate from them, from our minds, and have a different point of view, a different opinion, a different perspective, and still be loved. So they're both unconditional love, which I notice isn't a really big buzzword right now. We talk about self-love, inner child healing, reparenting, self-acceptance, but nobody's using unconditional love anymore, which is interesting to me because I think it still applies very much so. That unconditional love means you're not earning it and you don't have to perform perfectly or agree with me or have my approval in order to be loved. Meaning that and gosh, what does that mean? To be loved, it's a feeling and it's a knowing. And it's a feeling of you're okay and you're not going to be rejected or dismissed or ignored or neglected. That you're seen and felt and understood and you're connected with and you're wanted. And you just know it by a feeling that you get from being with the people that love you and that you experience love with. And at the level of like cognitive understanding, but like a compassion is like a bonus, a big bonus from the people who love you. And so many of us just like these two things were not in the definition of parenting. The definition of parenting for so many generations was you let your baby cry themselves to sleep and learn how to deal with things on their own. And so it's almost like it, we separated ourselves in infancy and never felt that connection of being unconditionally accepted. And then as teenagers, when we're trying to rebel and have our own point of view, we're also beaten down, punished, and told never to say or think that again, and silenced. Just as we're developing, we're testing our own voice. So many of us were just silenced and told to stop what we were becoming. And what we really needed was some space at that time to explore and to come back to a safe place where we knew that whatever we were exploring and discovering and finding out and maybe making mistakes, that we were still going to have a home, a heart home. And so when those two things are missing, we just kind of wander the earth looking for these sources of love out there in all these other places that can never give it to us. We look for it in an audience, we look for it in a salary, a job title, a zip code, um, a relationship that can prove to us at every second that we're worthy of being loved like we were seeking as an infant, all these things. And so we end up in this cycle of incompleteness. Um, and what this person, my partner's brother's story, gave me was this sense of hope and possibility that love can repair adults, um, our bodies in motion, and animals and nature and children and connection can truly repair us and fill in these gaps that were woefully absent in our childhood, if we open to them and follow the breadcrumbs that are calling to us. We listen for these breadcrumbs, the trail of breadcrumbs of, you know, unlikely next steps. I mean, from prison guard to elementary school teacher. And, no one in that family would have predicted it, but that's because there was no healing vision within the family of origin. That healing happens in unexpected ways. And if we rely on our planning mind, our rational mind, our left-sided brain that was conditioned by these gender extremes and other polarizations of our culture, we're probably going down the wrong path. If like culture and society and expectations are approving of our path, my guess is we're not in our true nature, and we're not truly deeply joyful and connected to that which inside us is connected to all of life and all of nature and all of ecology. When we are molding ourselves into a narrow role, more and more narrow as our culture specializes and technologizes more and more, we mold ourselves into this role that we play for society that says this is successful. So this is like tying back to my previous video on success. Um, and you know, to be a male that's not the major breadwinner, not the highest earner in a household, takes a lot of strength from both the man and the woman in the relationship. If it's a man and a woman in the relationship, both members of the partnership. That's another gendered conditioning that we have. That the male goes and as a warrior and the protector goes and makes the higher salary so that the whole family can be supported by that, and the woman can just tend to the other things. And so there's a lot that that we can choose to break through in terms of our conditioning. And I would contend that it's not a choice. It's not like, again, it's not a rational choice that we wake up one day and decide, I'm going to break my conditioning. What I notice, and what was also mentioned in the Martha Beck podcast, is that this comes about generally through the pain of trauma that we wake up. And in the healing of trauma, we, if we examine ourselves and our lives and look inside at our journeys, we can develop and we can become attuned to these other possibilities as we reach toward healing, as we long for healing, as we feel the pain of not healing. That's how we come to these movements. So, sitting in a room and saying, I'm going to heal is typically not how it happens. It's the pain increases and increases until the point where we can no longer endure the life that supported all of that pain. And we begin to open and surrender to the arrival, piece by piece, crumb by crumb, moment by moment, of another life that will heal us. That's how it's happened for me. That's how it's happening for me, how it's unfolding continuously. And I'll just close with this quote, also from the Martha Beck podcast, that she said she heard from a Peruvian shaman. And when it came out of his mouth, she's just stopped and with her jaw open and said, I need to memorize that. And it is this: compassion is the evolution of consciousness in the healing of trauma. So we acquire compassion through the traumas that we've gone through, the journey of healing, which is the journey of waking up to the fact that we have trauma and to look at the experience of that trauma for us specifically. What was it? What happened to us and how did we respond? And to grow in our understanding of ourselves. And in that growth, that's where compassion, that's the soil in which compassion lives and grows. So compassion is the evolution of consciousness in the healing of trauma. And the male warrior, conditioned warrior, who becomes a conscious peacemaker, has developed compassion for the world. And we know that that has only come through the journey of healing his own trauma.